Welcome to From the VC's Bookshelf, a podcast from TBR, the College System of Tennessee, the state's largest higher education system. In this series, we examine how we might re-envision the work we do and how we work together as we move into a post-pandemic world. Please join our host, Dr. Heidi Lemming, Vice Chancellor for Student Success, as she leads a live discussion with industry experts and leaders throughout our system.
In our fall 2023 podcast series, we are leaning into themes found in Atomic Habits by author James Clear. The TBR System Office has been engaged in testing our mindset interventions with students in gateway courses, specifically math courses, for about 7 years now. While Atomic Habits doesn't specifically use the word mindset, the book touches on similar themes. So our series will draw connections between the two bodies of work and also highlight how our research partners, faculty, and staff are working to change student habits and mindsets in support of academic success and college completion. In today's podcast, I'm excited to be talking to two lead researchers at the Motivate Lab, a research lab that focuses on understanding the mindsets and motivations that promote learning, growth, and well-being. Those insights are used to develop evidence-based solutions that can be applied across educational, extracurricular, and work contexts. TBR has partnered with the Motivate Lab since 2015 on multiple system-wide projects to support student motivation and success. So today I'm joined by, again, two researchers. I'll introduce them real briefly. Dr. Chris Hulleman is an associate professor of education, psychology, and public policy at the University of Virginia. He is also the founder and director of the Motivate Lab, which collaborates with educational partners or practitioners to help address inequality. His team develops and tests changes in educational practice that support the motivation of students from historically marginalized backgrounds in education. He received his bachelor's from Central College, Iowa in 1993 and his PhD in social and personality psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2007. Prior to his career in psychology, he spent 6 years as a teacher, coach, and social worker. It's good to talk to you, Chris.
Good to see you too. And most importantly, I lived in Nashville, Tennessee for 2 years.
There we go. Dr. Yoi Tibbetts is the research director at the Motivate Lab and an assistant professor of education at the University of Virginia. He researches motivation, achievement, and well-being with a focus on changing institutional structures to better support students who have been chronically underserved by the education system. In addition to implementing student-centered interventions designed to address issues related to inequity in education, Dr. Tibbetts has a distinct focus on leveraging research to create more motivationally supportive learning contexts. He earned his PhD in experimental social psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2017 and his bachelor's from Swarthmore College in 2009. Yoi, it's also good to see you today.
Great to see you, Heidi. Thanks for inviting us.
You haven't lived in Nashville, though, so that puts you a step behind.
I know. Unfortunately, not been there plenty of times because I've had the privilege of working with you all, but not lived there yet.
Well, I know we've had both of you here in the state of Tennessee quite a bit over the years, so that's always a way to expose you to our system and our state. But for our listeners who might not know about the work that you've been doing with the TBR system over the last 7 years, can you all give an overview of that work around academic mindset?
Sure, happy to. As you mentioned, Heidi, we've been partnered since 2015, so it's been some time here. And one of the basis of a lot of the collaborative aspects of our work together has been something that we call the Student Learning Mindset Survey, which has been a TBR system-wide learning mindset survey of your first-year students, looking at where their learning mindsets are and where their various motivational constructs are in relation to student outcomes, how they vary by different demographic status. We really use that as a data source to propel a lot of our other work forward because we have, a data set that we can look at and say, hey, it would really be beneficial to focus on this particular mindset for this particular group of students at this institution or multiple institutions. That has allowed us to partner in a number of ways moving forward. So for example, I'll highlight a couple and then allow Chris to talk about a much larger initiative. We partnered back in 2018 on something called the Student Voices Initiative, which was geared around creating a focus group protocol that is delivered by students for students to unearth issues related to belonging and identify policies and practices that can better support student belonging, because as we saw from the learning mindset data, belonging is a significant and consistent predictor of student outcomes, whether that's grades, retention, etc. We've also done a fair amount of work in your first year experience courses. We did a lot of work at National State Community College. Shout out to Jessica Rabb and Marla Perry doing something called a relevance affirmation lesson plan, which was all about supporting students to think about their core values and how they're connected to the act of going to college, and as a way of aligning their motivation for going to college with what they really care about. We've also done a number of site visits, as you mentioned, Heidi. We've been north, south, east, west, I think all the major cities in Tennessee, hanging out with faculty, learning from students, which has, in addition to the learning mindset survey, really provided us a strong basis to advocate for various strategies to support students. And then lastly, and more recently, and perhaps most largely, we've been doing a lot of work with your co-requisite math courses, scaling an intervention called the utility value intervention, which my colleague here, Chris Hulleman, pioneered way back in graduate school and is now being scaled to the entire system. And I'll flip it to him to talk more extensively about that work.
Yeah, thanks, Yoi. Such a cool project. Not only have we been able to get this student support out to all the community colleges, all 13 in the state, but we've been able to work really closely with some of the math faculty. So shout out to Ashley Smith, who's at Chattanooga State, who's a co-PI in that project. And then Emma Holsketter, who got to start working full-time in the TBR system office as a result of that work. And so we just had the great fortune of working really closely with a lot of folks throughout the system. In that case, it's, hey, here's a little instructional activity that you can embed in your course. It takes 15 to 20 minutes twice during the semester that can have a big benefit for your students in terms of how motivated they are, how much relevance they see in learning math. And that translates into increased pass rates and then increased success as they move along down the pipeline. And we wouldn't have been able to do that project here in Tennessee without a long-standing partnership with Chattanooga State. So we started working with the folks there right after our site visits, and Donna Siegel, who was at Chat State at that time. Now I think she's at Walter State or maybe she's not at Walter State anymore. She's moved on.
She's actually working for the system office now. Yeah.
No, that's so cool. I just haven't connected with Donna in forever. Yeah. Well, Donna invited us to come and we did some professional development generally, but then we got connected to Ed Nichols and the folks in math, and we did several projects there. But one of them was, hey, we had this utility value intervention that we've used in math and other places. How can we make it like customize and fit your context at Chat State? And based on that, then we were able to get the funding from the National Science Foundation to do the big project across the state. So we're just about done with that project. We've finished data collection. We're analyzing the data. In fact, we've published one paper. Emma is a published author now. Ashley Smith is a published author as a result of that project. So many wins. And it all started way back when in 2014 when Tristan Denley was your vice chancellor at that time, or one of the vice chancellors, I think that was his title. He came to a conference that I was presenting at, and we hit it off. And here we are, all these years later, and you're now in that similar kind of leadership role at the system office. So kudos to TBR for all the system change work you all were willing to do. It's fun. It's fun to be a part of the work.
Yeah, thank you. Well, according to the book, motivation is overrated, and our environment often matters more. So human behavior follows the law of least effort, will naturally gravitate toward the option that requires the least amount of work. With this in mind, we should create an environment where doing the right thing is as easy as possible, and the goal is to make habits inevitable and bad habits impossible. So how do you feel about this message that motivation is often overrated? And I mean, if you agree or disagree, particularly in the light of the work that you've been doing on mindset.
That's a great question. You want to go first on this one, or do you want me to? Yeah, I'll just say, yes, sometimes motivation is overrated. And I think there's a piece of motivation that our approach takes a little differently than James. I think it's James Clear takes. Mm-hmm. We don't think motivation isn't just a property of the person. Motivation is a property of the environment as well. So that environments can be more or less motivating for humans, just like individuals can have more or less motivation. And I think he gets there when he talks about changing your system and using habits to, like you said, make the things you want to do easy and the things you don't want to do hard. Some of the things he talks about to structure habits, we would call motivational principles. So I think there's a lot of agreement in terms of like how to go about many of the things. I would just might call them slightly different things. And I do think there's things that I think I probably disagree with him on, but I think there's a lot there that when we talk about making stuff attractive, that's making it valuable. So we talk about that, and value is a motivational piece. So I think he's using motivation maybe as a little more constricted way than we do.
Okay. Yoi, thoughts about that?
I feel similarly, although I do have a hard time as a motivation researcher saying motivation is overrated. I tend to think motivation is important, but the environment in which it is cultivated is equally, if not more important. Like I agree with that principle. There's that famous improvement science quote by Edwards Deming that every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it does. And so if you have students who are less than motivated or underperforming through your lens, that is because that is how your system is currently designed. And so I do agree that through creating more motivationally supportive learning environments, we can in fact impact learning and student outcomes, but you're also impacting motivation. And I think motivation is critical to student success. So I guess I'm riding the fence here, but I'm saying I fully agree that, the context is important for supporting motivation. And if you can create a context that is more motivationally supportive, you absolutely should. And that's the more powerful, sustainable way about supporting student success. What I slightly disagree with is that motivation is underrated, because motivation is overrated, because we wouldn't be trying to motivate students if motivation wasn't a key predictor of success. And I don't think that's what James is saying, and perhaps he's doing that a little bit just to make a point by saying that it's overrated. And I probably would be doing the same if I was trying to create a New York Times best-selling book that sold over 15 million copies. So I entirely agree where he's coming from in terms of the context being important. But I also think motivation itself, in and of itself, is an important construct to consider.
Yeah.
Heidi, if I just say what Yoi said just slightly differently, I think Yoi would probably agree with this. It's that the power of an individual's motivation is overrated. So we often think if you're motivated, you can overcome any barrier.
Right.
And there's just structural barriers out there that are going to prevent people from getting what they want, even when they're super motivated. And it's the structures are in education for racially minoritized students, lower income students. It's, there's just more barriers there in our system. So what we would say is motivation's not overrated, but that it's who we think's responsible for motivation is misplaced. That
right.
The educators and the system needs to take on a lot of responsibility for how motivated students are.
Right. Well, Atomic Habits presents this model for creating habits and breaking bad habits. So creating good habits and breaking bad habits. To create a good habit, the author says, 1, you have to make it obvious. 2, you have to make it attractive. 3, you have to make it easy. And 4, it has to be satisfying. The inverse for breaking a bad habit is you make it invisible, you make it unattractive, you make it difficult, you make it unsatisfying. So as you reflect on habits, goals, mindsets, both for your work, but even the broader kind of learning context, do you think this is a model that will work?
Yo, you want to give this one a shot first?
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking about this, looking through the steps, and it intuitively makes a lot of sense. If you make good habits super obvious and attractive and easy and satisfying, of course you're going to engage with them. The only pushback I had is how easy is it to do? So for example, flossing, we'll start with that one, trying to floss. Like, I've been trying to floss for years, on and off. I'm an intermittent flosser. I make it obvious. It's right next to my toothbrush. I brush my teeth twice a day. but it's not attractive. Like I'm not looking at that floss being like, I really want to, floss my teeth today. It's not necessarily easy. If I haven't done it for a little while, my gums bleed. It's not super satisfying because it kind of hurts. But if somehow I were able to make it attractive, easy, and satisfying, I'm sure I would engage in it more. So to the extent that it's possible, those steps intuitively make a ton of sense. And you can tell I'm not basing this a ton on, research right now. It's just personal experience as I was thinking through these steps. And I haven't interrogated, the research or the science behind what James has put forth here. But again, from an intuitive standpoint, it makes sense. From a practical standpoint, I wonder about the feasibility and how easy it is to implement. But the steps feel right.
Yeah, I'd just say I got a chuckle reading through this book. I didn't read it super closely, but I went through and read some places more than others. I got a chuckle because he talks about B.F. Skinner in his book, and inspiration for a lot of his work is behaviorism. And without getting too technical, behaviorism was really the study of how can we structure the environment in a way so that we reinforce good behaviors and we increase them, or the behaviors we want, and we discourage or negatively reinforce the behaviors we don't want. And that works for a lot of things. It just doesn't work for everything, especially for humans. And Skinner learned this the hard way in the 60s, and there was a big smackdown between him and Noam Chomsky, and the cognitive revolution in psychology and was born. But the reality is there's good science behind some of this behavior stuff. It just doesn't solve all the things that I think James wants it to. But I like how his principles around the system and trying to make behavior habits connected to your environment. I think that's really powerful.
Just take this a step further for me, because as we're talking about flossing, for example. But let's bring this into the work that we do here with students and learning. So are there things that from a habit or environment standpoint that we think are beneficial? I mean, I know we've been doing these interventions that are around kind of mindset in the classes, but are there actual more kind of concrete behavioral things that we should be thinking about when we're working with students to develop those good habits for learning?
Yeah, absolutely. I use one that we recommend to faculty in our workshops and in our online course. It's called regrading or retesting. So giving students the opportunity to redo their work. And in a typical classroom, most instructors don't structure it so that you can retake a quiz or a test. Some do, but most of us don't. I include myself in that as well. Part of the reason is we got a lot of content to cover, and it's a lot of work to grade the thing once, let alone grade it again. Especially, most community college faculty don't have a lot of TAs in helping them grade, or graders helping them grade. They got to do all the grading their own. They're teaching a lot of course sections. It can be impractical and a lot of extra work. But what that does as a structural behavior for students, if we say, hey, even if we say, hey, I expect you to revise at least one of your quizzes or at least one of your tests, but you revise any of them. If we set that up for them, that's a habit that reinforces, or that's a behavior that reinforces growth mindset. Because what does growth mindset say? It says we can improve our intelligence and abilities through effort, through trying hard things and failing, and doing things again until we get them right. So trying new strategies, including getting help and feedback from others. So that's a behavior that if we reinforce it, could become a habit for students. We wouldn't talk about it necessarily as using those habit words, but using his words. That's a structural way that you change the course to make this behavior easier.
Oh, we just lost him.
The instructor, if they can, that cut out.
Yep, you did.
But no, but if there's not a structure for that, how do students do it in the classroom? They don't have the power to say, hey, I want my math teacher to allow me to retake my test. Usually doesn't work out very well.
Yeah. Other things that if you were talking with a student, so we're talking about faculty interventions in the classroom. If you're talking to a first generation student, so they have no experience with higher education, weren't getting advice from a parent about how to navigate coursework or studying, is there a habit or a way to describe a process that would help them be more successful?
Yeah, I appreciate this question and Heidi, the push to make these examples more TBR and higher ed relevant, because that's where this conversation belongs, not intermittent flossing. And so as I think about the situation you just described there, first generation student, of which, I think last I looked, more than half of your students are first generation students. It really leads me to, I think, more strongly endorse some of what James was talking about in his novel. So to your initial point around how do you start good habits, make it obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying. Well, how do you structure the courses that you teach that are all those things for these incoming first generation students? So, for example, we talk a lot about sense of belonging here at Motivate Lab, and in our partnership with you, how do we create climates where students feel respected by their peers, connected to both their teachers and their fellow colleagues that they're learning with? And so can you create an environment where a first generation student who might be doubting their uncertainty, and in fact, we know they doubt whether or not they belong compared to their continuing generation student peers, can you create an environment where they walk in and they can't help but feel that sense of belonging? It's obvious, it's attractive, it's easy to see, and it's satisfying to be in a place where they feel like they belong. We also know that first generation students, relative to their peers, often reach out for help less. There's this sentiment that, I'm not sure if I belong here. I'm not sure if it's appropriate to go up and, ask questions of my faculty member. Well, no, the higher education space was built to serve you. It is your prerogative and your right to go and seek out help from your instructors. And in fact, that's what your continuing generation student peers are doing. That's what the most successful students are doing. So how do we set up climates and situations that norm the idea that, reaching out for help is not a display of weakness or an indication that you're not learning or you're not smart or you're not good enough? But in fact, that is an adaptive strategy that successful students implement, that first generation students, if and when they do it, actually perform oftentimes on par as their continuing generation student peers. And so that's where I strongly endorse, setting up climates that really make it obvious and attractive, and easy and satisfying to engage in these adaptive behaviors, particularly for these students that have been chronically underserved, like the first generation students that we're using for this particular example.
Yeah. Anything you want to add to that, Chris? You're nodding.
No, yeah, you always got it right on.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I might throw this another question at you first. The author makes a distinction between setting habits that focus on specific goals as the outcome versus habits that have a systems-based approach. So goals are about the results you want to achieve. Systems are about the processes that lead to those results. So the book claims that if you're having trouble changing your habits, the problem isn't you, the problem is your system. You've mentioned this in terms of our educational system in some respects already. Bad habits will repeat themselves again and again, not because you don't want to change it, but because you have the wrong system for change. You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. So the work that we've been doing at TBR around mindset is an attempt to alter the system in many ways, right? Not just at one institution, but across multiple institutions in the state to get better results for our students. So are there connections that you can make when we think the author describing this habit setting, this mindset philosophy that we've tested at our TBR institutions, particularly in math courses, that you can make there about, again, that system, the system part of that work?
Yeah, absolutely. Like from and part of this is who are you thinking about? The system looks differently. So if you're thinking about the faculty, the system looks one way. They're at the centerpiece and the pieces around it. It looks a little bit different from the student perspective. So I can take the faculty perspective first. The faculty perspective, the mindset work we're doing is helping encourage them to think about what are their instructional habits and how do those instructional habits play out and impact student learning and student motivation and student persistence and success. And so those things are giving them tools like the utility value intervention, for example, that they can use in their classrooms to help students make connections between the math they're learning in their lives. And then they can play that forward with students and continue that work to say, okay, what else can I do as an instructor to amplify the meaning and purpose for this course for students, because this reflection activity got them started. Now, what else can I do to support them? So that's an example of what it looks like from the instructor perspective, this mindset work. We talk about belonging and sense of belonging and growth mindset and other things as well from that perspective. Let's go to the student perspective. If I'm a student and I'm sitting in this system, I have my own personal habit system about how I study. And then there's like the classroom space and how the instructor sets that up. And so as a student, I want to set up my personal system in a way that maximizes getting what I want. So if students don't have a place to study that's quiet, free of distractions, that can disrupt so much for them. And so that's usually the first thing I ask a student if they come into my office and they're struggling with anything, whether it's they're overwhelmed with life or they're having a hard time in my course. I'm like, okay, tell me about like your environment. Where do you study? What does that look like? And if they can tell me what's there and, you know, where the pencils are and, you know, where their headphones are, like, okay, we're in good shape. But if they're like, yeah, some days I study here, some days I study there, some days with our friends, I'm like, okay, is your environment part of the challenge here for you? But then we think about the classroom they step in. How is the instructor set that up to support them or not? And as Yoi pointed out, if you're a first-gen college student, there for many, not all, but for many, they don't have that college knowledge of like, this is how you college. If you want to get ahead in your courses, you start studying on day one. You don't wait till 2 days before the exam. If you're struggling, you talk to the professor. That's okay. My wife, who's a first-generation college student, she thought it was not okay to go to office hours. It wasn't until after she graduated and she was a college access counselor herself. She's like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think that was a thing I could do. Whereas, you know, I went into every professor's office hours all the time as an undergrad. So how is that space set up to make it easy, inviting for them to be successful? And that's going to vary based on the student. Does that help make that connection?
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are some really great examples because, again, from an audience perspective, with this podcast, we have professionals that listen, but we also have students or even adults who might be thinking about going back to college and have struggled. Maybe they started and didn't finish. And so they've struggled, but, you know, is there a different way to kind of think about this work in the context of, again, motivation, but also just how you structure your life on campus, you know, how you study, things like that might make it easier. And so I want to be able to provide kind of both those different perspectives. You know, with that, a lot of our students still we're not saying that having goals is not a worthy effort, right? It's always important to have kind of these goals in mind. But I'm curious, and Yoi, maybe you can answer this one first. When does tracking our goals go too far, right? Like, you know, I'm a very goal-driven person. I like my checklist. I'll be honest. Makes me feel good to get that off. But how do we know as an individual when we're tracking the right measures with the right mindsets, like to achieve those goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. And something I've actually been thinking about a lot as my research career has evolved. Starting out implementing interventions in classrooms as a graduate student, the goal is always improve grades. We want students to achieve better. And more recently, in part because of, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic, in part because we've started partnering with some mental health professionals and the American Association of Colleges of Osteopathic Medicine, and really thinking about mental health outcomes and to what extent those should be prioritized above and beyond everything, because you're not achieving performing well if you don't have, you know, the right mental health measures. And so that's allowed me, or forced me rather, to take a step back and think exactly what you asked, Heidi. Are we tracking the right measures in relation to the right learning mindsets? Because like you, I'm very goal driven. If I have a goal, I'm far more likely to obtain it and enact behaviors that are adaptive to hit that goal. Now, if I become too goal-driven and am unable to see the forest through the trees, so to speak, then I think that can be a detriment to my journey to hit that goal. But at the end of the day, I still think having that goal identified is important. And in my research career now, I'm starting to think, okay, what is the end goal? Is it grades? Is it retention? Both of those things I think are super important. To what extent is mental health now part of my research model as I think about how to best support students so that they can thrive? And then this career piece, which I know, Heidi, you've been on for a while here, is how do we connect these ostensibly academic metrics to career and life success in the future? And so while I used to think of learning mindsets as a way, and probably too narrowly constrained, as improving student grades, I'm starting now, and there's evidence out there to think about beyond just grades, how is it affecting long-term retention, long-term career aspirations and achievement? And then more importantly than ever, especially now, mental health and how that and all the implications that has for longer term performance. And that's just been an evolution the way I guess I've been thinking about learning mindsets, but I don't think I'm alone there. I think the field is very much drifting in that direction, and rightfully so, given the current state of things in the world.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad that you brought that in, because obviously that's on the minds of a lot of folks, is the mental health of the students that we're working with, well, and even faculty staff at the institutions right
Absolutely.
now. So, Chris, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, what I would add is this is where I wish James had said a little more, because I think goals and so he talks about the outcome, the outer layer as outcomes, right? And sometimes we focus too much on that, and I 100% agree. Those are good for what they're good for. And in the book, he talks about if you're in LA and you're flying to DC, and you turn the direction 3 degrees, which he measures out as like 7 or 8 feet, that you'll end up in New York. And so a little deviation at the beginning matters a lot. And that's your aiming point, right? Your goal is your aiming point. But that aiming point doesn't necessarily help you make sure that you get to study 2 hours every day. When you're tired, when you're hungry, or there's other things, you get asked to do something socially with family or friends. So there's got to be something that kicks in to help you do that. Habits are a piece of the puzzle. But another really important piece of that puzzle is how much energization, how much motivation, it's maybe to use James's words, is there for that process. So it's not just the outcome, it's the process. And so he talks about aligning your identity with goals. And I think that's where I just wish he would have said more, because I think we would talk about that very differently. We would talk about, shifting your mindset and aligning, your actions with your identity. It's not so, for him, it was his example in the book is, okay, just say I'm the type of person who runs. I'm a runner instead of I need to run more. I'm a runner. And I think that's not enough to support that. We've really got to think about, especially for students, but this goes for faculty too. What is our identity? What's really most important to us? And do these things line up with that, although from outcomes to processes, and line those up. And that's where you get this multiplication of energy and drive. Because, hey, even when a process is easy and set up for you, sometimes you're tired, and so that's where knowing that this represents my 2 hours of studying, represents getting up to that top of the hill. It doesn't represent drudgery and boredom, right? So how do we use that identity part of this throughout the process is really kind of an important piece. And that's, I think, was missing a little bit. But I do think what happens with goals is they get to be controlling, and then that undermines motivation. So you're focusing on your goals too much when they're freaking you out, they're making you too anxious, or they're making you feel controlled to do something you don't want to do. Then now you're focusing too much on the goal.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. That's great insight. And we've talked a lot about how faculty can kind of shape the environment to assist students, and both a faculty perspective on that and a student perspective on that. One of the things that has changed a lot, even in the last year, when we talk about environment, is technology, particularly AI in higher education. We're having a lot of conversations about that, with our faculty. It can fully automate a lot of habits. Technology can do that. Like if we want to save for retirement, we can automatically just take that money out. So I don't even have to think about it. But it also can create bad habits. So we know binge watching and video games, that kind of social media, can create some negative things in our lives too. So I'm curious, as researchers in this field, if you've got some opinions about how technology is affecting this work around mindsets, and how that changes even academic behaviors for student success. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because it is an emerging area, I think, that we're all trying to learn about right now.
It's such a great question. I'll just answer just briefly, because I've been having a few conversations about this. I think if you talk about like AI and a lot of the concerns there, students are going to use that. They're not going to actually think. They're just going to use AI to get the work done. And I agree with that. And what I think it means that you going to do that? Like, just take you, Heidi, in your work. Say there's a super important report that is going to go to the state legislature, which could impact TBR's funding for the next 5 or 10 years. And compare that with an email to an informational email that you're going to send out to your staff about the holiday party. Which of those is like more important for you to author and to have it just like perfectly correct and have your voice? And which one is like, oh, I'd be fine if ChatGPT wrote that email for me.
Yeah.
Which one of those?
Well, of course, the more social kind of work, right?
ChatGPT could take care of that. Yeah. So like if students are using ChatGPT for their stuff, we have to ask, is it like the social email, the holiday party email, that because they don't see any value or purpose to what you're doing? And so I think technology lays bare the fact that a lot of what we ask students to do doesn't connect to them, doesn't connect to their identity and who they are and who they want to be in the world. And so that's where I think education needs to step up and not be fearful of ChatGPT, but use it as an indicator that, oh yeah, if students are tempted to use this in my course, either they don't care or they have too much to do, they're overwhelmed and they need a, and we can't, that's a different story, but that lack of value and purpose in education. I don't know what you think, Yoi.
Yeah, I mean, even internally, we know there's some faculty who really want to try to embrace this technology, figure out a way to teach using this, because it's inevitable that students are going to use it, right? So then how do you tailor how you teach in that way? So yeah, Yoi, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's sort of where I am. And in some ways, how can you learn from students? Writing my dissertation was a grind. If I had ChatGPT, I would be the first to say that I would have leveraged that as a tool as I wrote my dissertation. Now, would I have copied it word for word? No, but I might have used it to, help me craft an outline to follow. And I think the days, and I'm going to steal some phrases from my our good colleague Ken Barron, of the professor being the sage on the stage, is going by the wayside, and we're quickly trying to become the guide on the side. And so how can you work with students and learn from students to embrace new technologies and new strategies for learning, like ChatGPT or AI? Because you're not going to fend it off. Like it is here. It is going to continue coming. I mean, it's just I think the public started hearing about ChatGPT last October, maybe November at the latest, and now it's everywhere. And in some ways, as it relates to our learning mindset work, this is going to sound sort of ironic or paradoxical, but I think it's kind of going to humanize the plight of, for example, the first generation student. I think as we start thinking about the data processing capabilities of AI and how it can look at a bunch of the quantitative data that we are collecting with the Learning Mindset Survey, or the qualitative data that we arduously were typing up interviews and focus group protocols and then hand coding it, and ChatGPT's ability to do that, or AI's ability to do that with a snap of the fingers, I think is going to lend itself to highlight the importance of learning mindsets much quicker and in ways that are much more efficient than we have currently been processing those data. And so in those ways, I've seen the data. We've all seen the data. Learning mindsets matter for academic outcomes, for retention, for well-being outcomes. So I think in some ways it's going to highlight the value of learning mindsets, because we'll be able to do these sorts of analyses and leverage AI's capability to continue making these points in probably more salient and compelling ways to students and faculty as they continue to embrace this sort of technology. So I'm slightly fearful of it, but at the same time, I guess I have just more of an optimistic disposition. I think there are ways that we can leverage it for good. And I think in this case, learning mindsets have been demonstrated to be, for good. And so emphasizing that with some increased capabilities on the technological side, I think will only make this work more important and highlight that. So, I mean, we'll see how that plays out, but that's my hope.
Yeah, right. Conversation will continue for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, we're kind of in our final time here, and I always like to wrap up my conversations with anyone on the podcast about just kind of overall takeaways. So, your overall assessment of the concepts described in the book, which of course you've already offered a little bit of critique on some of those concepts throughout the conversation today. But, if you were to consider kind of the more salient themes found in this book, what do you consider for students the most relevant? And are there new things that you would encourage us all to consider as we move forward?
I love the focus on the system. Form good habits, break bad habits seems like a no-brainer, sure. But thinking about how do you structure your learning environment in ways that will foster success makes a ton of sense. And, I'll come back to the example that you prompted for me, Heidi, around, first generation students and how they approach higher ed. And I would say, demand your system serve you. In higher education, you are the client. You should be reaching out for help when needed. You should be thinking about how the system is better serving you. And, shout out, for example, to Wendy Thompson and Sean Chisholm, who have been really championing the Student Voices initiative throughout TBR, which is this initiative designed to identify how do we better support students by listening to them. And I think, like ChatGPT and the evolution of that, students are going to be using that. And so how can we listen to them about why they're using it? Like Chris was alluding to, what value are they deriving it that maybe we can do a better job of highlighting within our own courses, and then allow that to set up a system that will allow you to thrive. But I think thinking about the system, thinking about ways you can demand the system serve you better as a student, and then hopefully the system, and I know TBR system will be responsive, otherwise we would have been partnering with you for, going on 10 years here, will be cognizant of that and really try to their capabilities to sustain systems, because that is the way of creating more sustainable structures for student success. It's not targeting individual students. It is, in fact, addressing the system, the structural, the systemic issues at hand. And so that's the biggest takeaway that I found to be compelling from that book in this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Yoi. Chris, what about you?
Yeah, same. The top thing I like about the book is the system approach. I think the top thing, so for people who are new to kind of, habits and how to form them, this book's a great place to start, and lots of tips and tricks of how to go about trying to set up habits that'll help you reach your goals. I'd say the key thing that to watch out for is when, your system that you're in, if you're a student, whether you're a faculty member, there's part of that system that you're in control of, and there's part of that system that you're not in control of. And so recognizing that you're going to max out if certain aspects of that system that you're not in control of aren't changed. So if you're a faculty member, for example, how much funding you get from the state to support math instruction at your school is something that you maybe have an influence on indirectly, but you mostly just have to try to structure your classroom environment the best way you can. And you can make a lot of improvement focusing there. But if year after year, overall, you're not serving some groups of students as well as you could be, that might mean structural change is needed, and same for students. And so I think I would just try to, maybe for faculty, get inspired to think about what parts of the system of a student system are you in charge of that you could change that could benefit them, so that they're not just working with 1% improvement, because that was James's thing, right? These little things, you get 1% improvement a day. And like there's the example of the British biking team. Well, they're in control of their whole system, and so they can decide what bikes they get and all that. But like students don't get a change out, like, oh, I want all African-American math instructors. They don't get to choose that. They go to the local community college, they get what they get. So if you're an instructor, what are those pieces that you can change that are most beneficial from students? And if you don't know, then it's time to elevate student voices and talk to them.
Great. Thank you. Well, it's really been, I think, a good conversation today to get, again, a connection between what's out there in the popular press, right, about these concepts, and how, right, from a research perspective, we're also being into this maybe in slightly different ways with students, but thinking about similar kinds of concepts to support student success in higher education. And many of the names that you all have mentioned throughout the conversation today, we're going to be interviewing them as part of this podcast series. Right. So that, others who are tuning in can hear their specific experiences of doing this work on the ground with students, and kind of their perspective of how they've taken this approach to do system change at the institutional level, and maybe even speaking to the work, things that they've learned from you all as you've led that training effort for us. So thank you again for kind of setting the stage for future conversations and interviews that we'll have as part of this podcast series.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah, this was fun. Thank you, Heidi.
And we will continue that partnership. We're looking forward to, we got a couple more years of some additional research work that we want to look at and how we embed this in our high impact practice coursework. So looking forward to that partnership. So again, thank you for taking time.
Thank you for listening to this edition of From the VC's Bookshelf, brought to you by TBR, the College System of Tennessee, powering the state's economy and changing the lives of thousands of graduates, starting successful careers each year. To learn more about upcoming book selections or to register to attend discussions live, visit tbr.edu/bookshelf.